All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for just making that quick transition. I will wait just a second before we get started with Allie's presentation. I hope that you all are enjoying the summit so far. We are almost there. One more day tomorrow. I'm going to ask that you utilize the chat as we've been loving the feedback, loving your comments, your questions. We welcome all of that. And so I am going to take a moment just to introduce my friend and colleague, Allie Wilkosz. She is our Director of Family Programming for Within Health, and Allie has over 2 decades of experience supporting clients and families affected by eating disorders across all levels of care. Allie brings a unique, it said Alexandra, but I'm so not used to calling you Alexandra.
No one does, not even my mom, so we're good.
Thank you. As I mentioned, Allie is the director of family programming at Within Health, and she leverages her expertise in implementation science to design impactful, evidence-informed programs that foster lasting change. A dedicated educator and advocate, Allie is committed to empowering families, equipping providers, and advancing outcomes for those on the path to eating disorders. I'll turn it over to you, Allie.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you everyone for being here on a Thursday afternoon. I really appreciate it. I know that's been so excellent so far. I've been really enjoying it, so hopefully everyone else has too. And then this afternoon, we're going to talk just a little bit about the intersectionality of family work and eating disorder treatment. It's one of my favorite things to talk about when we're talking about teamwork and family work, all put together. So some of the objectives today will be to identify 3 key principles of family systems theory and be able to provide examples illustrating each concept in clinical settings, organizational dynamics, or in the treatment and understanding of eating disorders. You'll be able to describe 2 common family roles and analyze how these roles show up within interdisciplinary treatment teams, including how the dynamics can impact collaboration and decision-making in eating disorder treatment settings. And we'll kind of focus on how to apply concepts of family dynamics to reflect on personal team participation in care, with attention to how these patterns could emerge and show up in eating disorder teams and develop one strategy to enhance professional collaboration overall. So that, amongst many other things, hopefully we'll be able to get out of our time together today. So I'm going to move forward and just kind of start with, I know that everybody here today is coming from all different places with one goal, obviously, to serve those who are struggling with eating disorder symptoms and those who support those who are struggling. And, one of my main points across the board is that whether you're, supporting people at meals or you're managing the medications or you're providing medical care or you're doing psychotherapy, it really doesn't matter. What mostly matters is that you're part of the client's relational system and that system is a part of the healing. So when we think about our clients, we're not just thinking about them in isolation, we're thinking about them in context. And we as a treatment team all together are a major part of that context. And so from whatever perspective you're coming at, this is all applicable as we treat families. So just kind of bringing it back to basics, like what is a family system? When I say that word over and over, what am I talking about? And basically, a family system is the overall structure and connectedness of a family as a whole. So it describes how all of the members are linked together, what their relationships are like, how they affect and impact each other. There's a strong focus on just different roles and boundaries and rules and hierarchies that define the family unit. So it's the system as a whole, kind of the aerial view when I think about the forest and not the trees. That's what I think about when I think about a family system. And family systems theory, there has evolved over time and such, but it is in general, a psychological and therapeutic framework that sees the family as an emotional unit where each member's behavior influences and is influenced by others. So rather than focusing solely on the individual, the theory considers the interconnectedness of family members and how patterns of interaction shape functioning. So prior to family systems theory really coming about, oftentimes people were treated individually. We live in a culture that really emphasizes individuality, loves to stress, the whole you can do this on your own and you got this concept. And so family systems theory kind of says, wait a minute, when you think about a person, we can't really just think about them in isolation. We really have to think about the entire unit and the interconnectedness and how each person impacts each other is and in the family system and then in other systems as well. But today we're focusing on family systems. So really very, very relational concept. And um, it came about right around the 1950s as a reaction against, as I mentioned, individual focused therapy, and quickly evolved into many different branches, addressing like relationships, patterns, roles, talking about families and individuals within families, families as a whole, and how that all impacts someone's psychological well-being, which ultimately impacts their emotional, social, financial, every piece of their well-being. So it there's a long history. We could probably do an entire presentation on family systems theory and how that came to be. But some of the main, for those who have studied this, some of the main players, so to speak, starting with Murray Bowen family systems theory, where he talked a lot about differentiation, emotional triangles, and multi-generational patterns, and then kind of evolved throughout time building on those concepts. So we had the structural family therapy, where it talked a lot about subsystems and boundaries and hierarchies, building upon the original concepts. And then more experiential family therapy that came to be, where we're taking those and building upon that by adding concepts related to self-esteem, to congruent communication, and real strong like emphasis on roles. And then as we move more forward to strategic family therapy, where the focus was more on the interventions and the strategies to be able to kind of get into the families and help heal and talk more about like those structures and subsystems and boundaries and how we can manage those and how they not only impact, but how we can also make changes. And most recently, a lot of the family systems work has moved into like a lot of couples work too. So thinking of a family as not only the traditional thought that you have, but more so a family of choice or just simply couples alone or anyone in connection to someone else. And so that's a lot of John Gottman's work. So again, this could be an entire presentation in and of itself, but just wanted to highlight the evolution and how, some of those real core principles of family systems theory still exist, and how they've kind of been elaborated on and expanded upon to broaden our way of thinking about families and family systems. And one of those original concepts, and one thing I really love to think about whenever I'm working with families is that they're not like a problem to be solved, but more so a system to be understood. So if we walk into the framework as saying, like, oftentimes there's lots of jokes about families, there's lots of thoughts about issues coming from families and movies about it and songs about it and everything in our society. But it's not really, if we think about families as just being problematic, that can be problematic for us, right? So it's more so like seeking to understand, right? Trying to be curious about the families versus looking at the problems and trying to solve them. When we're working with families, we're really looking for understanding a lot about all of the different roles and how that has an impact on each other. And that's really important in our work, especially because oftentimes our clients are identified as the quote unquote problem that needs to be solved. And if we can shift out of that framework and more into a systematic way of thinking where we're talking about the whole system and how each is impacting each other, then we're going to approach our clients in a much different way. We're going to approach our family systems in a much different way. So it's really important to not focus on the problem, but more so the system and the dynamics and the interplay between everything when we're working with our clients. So learning family systems theory allows all members of the care team to treat the person in context, which leads to more compassionate, effective, and systematic care, which seems really obvious, but really if we can, take a moment to really think about that, it's super important. Oftentimes family work can not be as important, right? We have a lot of things that are front and center when we're working with our clients, and the family work can oftentimes take a bit of a back seat, but especially for someone like me, I kind of feel like that really puts the client at disadvantage, right? Because when we're not treating the person in context. So we have only the perspective of the client who is struggling with many, many things. So understanding that person in context can help us get more understanding in general, right? And also like more compassion, understanding a little bit of the systems underneath that, why the person is struggling where they are, can also lead to like developing and helping the client have strategies to get through that because they now live in isolation, so we can't treat in isolation. And it's a nice kind of diagram of that that just shows that not only when we talk about family, we're not only talking about the family as we think about the family of origin, the nuclear family, but also we extend way beyond that, right? So eating disorders, to me, are very relational, and there are diseases of disconnection. And that primary disconnect is internal with the client, right? They're struggling with identifying their own values, who they are, what they want, what their dreams are, what their goals were, all prior to the eating disorder. And that's a lot of the individual work that is happening. But beyond that, there's disconnects with the nuclear family, and then there's disconnects to the community, and then there's disconnects to the treatment team, and there's disconnects to almost to like cultural identity, and then there's disconnects even spiritually, right? So we kind of move and broaden out. Family systems theory really highlights that, and it shows how the individual, like there's so many areas and of opportunity for the eating disorder to really play on the disconnect and to get in the middle there. So when we talk about that reconnection for recovery, the reconnection happening primarily internally first, but then also outwardly. So we're, wanting to reconnect with our families, our family systems, and then extended families and our society and our purpose and our goals and our sense of belonging. All of that is really highlighted well in family systems theory. And this diagram does a really great job of talking, about how you can't just treat that small core right there. We have to kind of go out. And then you can also think about all eating disorder impacts the relationship between the different families there too, right? So it not only impacts the individual, but there can be disconnects between the family and the treatment team and the family and the community. And so all of those areas are vulnerabilities for the client. So we want to work on really repairing those disconnects and really strengthening the bonds between all levels here. So this is a good, like I said, visual to keep in the back of mind when you're thinking about treating someone who's struggling with an eating disorder. And to get a little bit into some of the key concepts of family systems theory, there's a lot. So again, this could be its own presentation as well, but major key concepts we'll go into a bit. There's a differentiation of self, triangulation, the family is seen as an emotional system, family projection process, multigenerational transition process, sibling positions, and societal emotional process. And these, what I mean by talking about each of these, we'll explore a bit of how that kind of shows up in actual work. So differentiation of self is the ability to maintain oneself while staying emotionally connected to others. I think oftentimes we see this with our clients because there can be what some might like term enmeshment, or like a challenge with that right? Like there's a lot of black and white thinking. So being able, it either has to be their way or my way, or the eating disorders way or my way. And being able to like maintain and support someone in identifying themselves and staying emotionally connected to others at the same time, like not losing their goals and values and wants, but also not completely disconnecting from the others, is really important. So an example of that would be a teen who would want to take a gap year, but the parents disapprove, which we see often. And that could be for treatment, that could be for any reason whatsoever, but someone who is well differentiated can stay calm and clear, can explain their thoughts, their wants, their needs. They can, without having to necessarily feel as though they need to justify themselves, they can more so just be very firm and say, this is what I want and this is why I want it. And someone who struggles with that differentiation would be more likely to cave, which they call fusion, or to withdraw, which is to cut off, right? So they're like, forget it, I'm not gonna even try to talk about this, and kind of isolate and walk away, or they will just do whatever it is that they think that their family wants them to do, or their parents would want them to do in this situation. And again, those are other ways of disconnection, right? So you have the disconnect where you're completely separate from each other, or you have that where you're kind of on top and there's no room for difference. So differentiation of self is a major concept that we want to be able to support our clients in being able to obtain that skill, and understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that you are disconnected from the other individual. You can be two wholes together. And then there is triangulation. The most common times we see this is, and we've heard of this, is whenever that there's any type of, oftentimes like with a divorce or a parental disagreement, right? So there's maybe you have two members of the family who are in direct conflict with each other, and you kind of pull the third person in to mediate or to diffuse the tension. So that can be as explicit as two people having an argument and then pulling in the third. So in this example, a child becomes the go-between. So you might have the parents who are arguing, and then all of a sudden they'll turn to the child and say, what do you think? Or don't you think that they're always like this? Or whatever that might be. And that kind of helps like triangulate, gets the tension off of them and brings it more in to the third party. So that is a key concept that we're looking for all the time, especially if and we can see this happen a lot actually in family sessions when you're working with clients, keeping your eye out for that piece and seeing if that's a role that typically they might be being pulled into, or they might be triangulating in other ways, right? There might be triangulation between a child and a parent, and then the other parent is the one that's kind of pulled in as the third party. So either in any case, you're wanting to make sure that like triangulation isn't happening, because that can lead to major disconnects, and oftentimes avoidance of the issue that is actually taking place. So no one's really addressing that, just kind of going in circles. Another key concept is seeing the family as an emotional system. So as seeing them as one single emotional unit, and that like the functioning of each individual is interdependent and shaped like by patterns of emotional reactivity and anxiety across generations. So you are, in this, we can say this, things go on generation by generation, right? We are impacted by the generation above and above that and above that, all by just by being connected to each other, and being able to, when you're working with families and noting that it doesn't just stop at the people in the room. Oftentimes it's a good question to ask someone. If someone's struggling with a relationship with their mom, for example, you might want to ask the mom, like, what's your relationship with your mother? And kind of look for some kind of patterns of disconnect or patterns of tension that could be being passed down generation by generation. And as an example would be like a child starts to have panic attacks during periods of stress with the parents. So it's not that the child is having the panic attacks because they are, just panicking and having a tough time. They're more so reflecting the entire shared emotional process. So that can happen in the house if there's tension with any other. If you might see someone all of a sudden struggling with things, you taking a look at the environment and taking a look at what the parents and the family members are going through can oftentimes give clues as to what might be happening. That it's not that the person that you're working with is working in an isolated process. It's more so like what's happening in the home, which goes without saying, but is actually very important, because again, when we can take a look at that, you can also kind of see, well, if the eating disorder is working as a way to cope with some of this stress and tension, then it would be good to know that that's where that's coming from, right? And then you can bring the family in as a whole and talk through what's happening and how that's impacting the person, and why the eating disorder might be flaring up, or it might be particularly challenging in the moment. So taking a look at the whole family as an emotional system is imperative. Another concept is that family projection process. So in this, parents unconsciously transmit their emotional issues or anxieties or conflicts to their children. And this can shape the child's development and can impair differentiation. So an example is a parent who might be worried about their body image and aesthetics. Perhaps this is something that they've carried on in their own world for a while. They might constantly pressure their child to look a certain way. And so then the child begins to absorb that anxiety and begins to believe that their worth depends on their looks. And this is not something that came directly from the child, or it came directly from being passed upon. Like, so when you're talking to clients and they have different ideas about the way that things are, the way that they see themselves, the way that they see the world, it's always very helpful to like examine what it is that could be going on in the family system, and whether or not this is something that is being passed along and reinforced in the home. Because you can do a lot of work. For example, if we use body image, you can do a lot of great body image work with clients, but if they're going home to an environment and that the opposite is being consistently projected and consistently spoken upon, then it's really challenging for someone to go against the grain there. And we see that oftentimes in treatment make really healthy choices and kind of get into a really healthy framework, but then put back into the environment, they can all be undone. So understanding the emotions and the anxieties that could be projected upon each client is really important. So we can then examine, like, can go into that dynamic and talk a little bit more about that, and how, and also bring awareness, right, to the, and help the client differentiate between themselves and their families. Multi-generational transmission process is another key concept in family systems theory. And those are just behaviors and beliefs that are passed down, influencing how future generations interact and cope. So again, it goes back a little bit to what we had spoken about previously, but if a family has a history of avoiding emotions or conflict, then the children could adopt those similar behaviors and not learn ever how to really resolve their conflicts or really express their feelings. And then this goes on and on and on. So oftentimes, one thing that I've heard that is always a little bit challenging to hear is when someone might say, like, my mother never really said that they loved me and never really were able to, like, hug me or show me affection. And so I'm really uncomfortable with that. And so then that person goes on to have relationships, and then their partner might wonder why that's so uncomfortable, right? For something that feels much more normal to them. And then they go on to have children and they're not affectionate. And this kind of pattern continues to move forward and cause a lot of stress and tension and relational disconnects without a solid understanding of why this is. And then once you can understand why, and understand, like, that this is coming from a generational pattern that's been passed along, how can we stop this, right? How can we help the client to break that pattern and to engage in healthier behaviors, both with themselves and with others? And this also shows up a lot when we talk about conflicts, right? In the way that people handle conflicts. If there's a family culture that for generations, if your dad yelled, and so then their son learns to yell, and then they yell, and so it's kind of like, when I get angry, I yell, and that's how we work with conflict. And we all know that's not very helpful. Understanding that pattern can help, like, us put the stop and like slow down and understand where this is coming from and how can we change it. And also can help those who are being impacted by these behaviors gain some awareness and make it a little bit less about things being their fault or about them, and more so the patterns that have been passed down. And we can, like, support them in challenging those and making, like, effective changes where they're able to honor their true feelings versus patterns that have been just kind of passed down. It's a lot of work, but sibling position is a key concept, and I really love this concept. It's really interesting. It doesn't always, not every single time does it work, but birth order tends to shape the roles and expectations in the families. The idea is that the patterns can influence personality and relationship dynamics, and can make predictable traits develop within the position the person has in the family. So most common is the oldest child is responsible and takes on a caretaker role, and the youngest is a little bit more free, but also looking for more attention, since they might be the last, and so the parents are tired and their energy is spent otherwise. And so those are some. And the middle child usually is the wild child, right? Like, sort of the one who is more independent and doesn't take on as much responsibility, but also doesn't seek as much attention. And those are very, very general concepts. Not always, like I said, held true, but oftentimes we do see that. So understanding why someone might feel this huge sense of responsibility, if you can ask them a little bit about the family and the system that they grew up in, and you see, they grew up with a single dad was always working, so next thing you know, they're the ones who are responsible for taking care of their younger siblings, or they feel that sense of responsibility. And so that is really hard to, like, let go of, and to realize that you're not responsible for others, and that pressure doesn't belong to you. But that came up simply just because that's where you were born. And of course, like I said, there's many other traits that go into the development of those propensities towards particular behaviors. But like, I think about my family, for example, and my daughter is the opposite. My family is the opposite. My daughter is more of the attention seeker and wild child, and my son, who's younger, is more of the responsible one. So it definitely Doesn't always hold true, but it was really interesting. And if you think about yourself even and where you fall in your birth order, it's interesting to see if you kind of fit that role and how that played out, and if that was something that was actually like put onto you or something that you just assume implicitly. There's a lot to explore there, and it makes for some good conversation too. So sibling position is pretty interesting. And then there's the societal emotional process, which is that basically, as we talked about with families, like you could be taking on the emotions and the feelings and anxieties of the family. You can also see that in broader social systems, like especially if you're in a system that's under stress. So now, like in this example, during times of societal crisis, communities could become more reactive and divided, which can mirror the way anxious families polarize under pressure. So you see that on a larger scale, you're kind of pulling out a bit, which also makes a lot of sense, right? So if you are in a community or an environment that is very stressed, then that's going to trickle into the home, and then it's going to trickle into the individual. And so understanding and like zooming out a bit with our clients and asking a little bit about, okay, let's talk about your family. Now let's broaden out and talk about the community or perhaps the generation, depending on where that is, or the culture, or something more on a much more of a broad scope can help gain some understanding about different patterns that could have be emerging or could be continuously a struggle to disrupt in things in that nature, right? Understanding what's happening societally, especially nowadays, that there's a lot of that's in the news, which is at our fingertips, which is often way too accessible and not healthy. And so how does those types of environments that we're growing up in and that our clients are growing up in, how does that impact what is happening within families and ultimately within oneself? So really important to kind of delve into this piece with clients as you're working with them as well. And again, there's many other key concepts that are important, but I think when it comes to the families and the clients that we're working with, those are some of the ones that tend to show up the most and really, can be front and center when you begin to do family work to see what really stands out and which areas you really want to focus on and help towards repairing and healing. Because there's a strong role for the care team in family systems work. And, a lot of this goes without saying, but the real work happens in the home, right? The family is the team the family and the team are all part of one, right? But the real work is going to happen when the client goes into their environment, right? They're learning the skills and making the changes and practicing them and getting support and encouragement and being challenged in a healthy way. And then they need to take all of that they're learning in the groups and individual sessions and such and take it home and practice it where emotions are much higher, right? Where the stakes feel much bigger. And so if as supporters, as care team members, our job is to really help them be able to translate that work and bring it into the home, because that's going to be able to create the change, right? So they kind of get their sea legs about them when they're working with us as care team members. And then the practice is what happens when I take this and I do what I haven't always done or what my family hasn't always encouraged me to do. If I say something that goes against the grain, if I break a generational pattern that has been in place and I try to shake things up, how is that going to work? And if that fear and anxiety of disrupting those systems is there, then oftentimes they won't. And that's oftentimes where the eating disorder can come in, because that level of disconnect internally and that level of feeling like unsettled and not heard and not being able to express oneself can often lead to the use of eating disorder behaviors. So we want to encourage the development of all of that, but keep in mind too that, like, how do we take all of this and bring this into the family? So team members really kind of guide the process, but we work with the families to do the lifting. And that's to say that while we do all the work in those sessions, it's really important to make sure that our families are part of the treatment as well. Because we can't be doing all this work over on one side and then expect for it to translate to the other without bringing the other in and educating them, right? And helping them keep up to date. So if we're supporting and encouraging our clients to understand different key concepts when it comes to their family system, we have to also provide that education and support to the family. They have to understand what is happening as well. They might not recognize patterns too. They might not see things as clearly. And so we have an unbalanced sort of dynamic there, and making sure to bring in the families to the work that we're doing allows them to take all of that and bring that back to their homes, into their lives. Without them as being a part of it, it's a little bit uneven, and that can lead to a lot of stress and tension. Because again, it's all about understanding, not so much fixing. So this, as a team, our role is not passive. We're not meant to just sit back and let things happen without being able to support. But we're also, not telling our clients what to do or our families what to do. It's more so to be reflective, staying out of that like triangle that could be like existing, or even more than a triangle, right? Multiple different patterns could be like taking place right in front of us. And our goal is to just be able to observe that and offer different perspectives and see how that lands with each family, knowing very well that each family is very different. If we just think about all of those things we talked about in terms of the different concepts, when it comes to family systems, that each family is very, very unique, right? And so what works for one, as same in recovery, right, is not going to work for everyone. So being able to sit back reflexively and listen, and ask some questions and offer perspective, but not offer solutions, is kind of handing that power, right, encouragement back to the client and the family, so that they can continue to use the skills in every situation moving forward. Again, the last one is just a lot of what I was saying in terms of we're just offering possibilities and frameworks, and we might not get it right. And then they're going to teach us, know that we see that's great in theory, that doesn't definitely apply to our family. Okay, tell me more then, right? Like teach me more about how this doesn't apply to your family and how something else might. And all the while, these conversations they were having with the families is helping them gain an understanding about things they might never have really thought about before, because it's been so automatic. So our role as a care team, we have a huge role in family systems work. Everyone, from all different disciplines, but main like rule across the board is that we're not really giving directions, we're not offering solutions, we're more so offering opportunities for reflection and open discussion, which people don't often take the time to do that, right? Life is busy and families are busy, and when eating disorder recovery is in the mix, things are very like stressful, intense, and it's not often that they can take the space to really have these conversations and explore more of the whys, rather than the whats. So some foundational practices for all providers from every different discipline is to have an understanding of family systems theory. Again, it's very, very deep and rich, and not everyone is going to be able to gain a thorough understanding of all of the different pieces of it. But if we can think about those that we see that apply most to our families, it's really important to understand that. Most importantly, that the individual is part of a larger system, and that system, there's a lot of dynamics, and we cannot think of someone without thinking of the system they're in. And in doing that, we have to think about the system we're in, right? We have to reflect upon some of our own biases, some of our own standpoints, some of our own generational patterns that could be passed down in the way that we approach things, and how that can make us look at other families, right? And just making that assumption that every family operates the way that yours does can cause a lot of challenges. It can cause us to not be as curious, or to think that we know the way that things quote unquote should be. Definitely does not support our clients' development or recovery, because we're not taking a look at their situation, right? We're just speaking from our own. So understanding your own family of origin, your roles, your thoughts, your actions, what you grew up in, is super helpful in working with other families. And you want to know like certain reactions. Obviously, like if you are the oldest child, for example, and you're working with a child who is parentified or is taking on much too much responsibility, and therefore the eating disorder has become the outlet, it's very easy to go into how that had impacted you, right? To reflect that upon yourself and say, well, my parents did this, and I think that you should stop doing that because that's the way that things happen. But that's not necessarily 100% true, right? We can have that awareness, we can have that understanding, because you have that relatability coming from the same place, but you don't have all the other pieces that they're coming in with. So being able to understand your reactions and your roles can help give context and can help us not make as many assumptions. And Bowen said, like, you cannot take a client further than you've gone yourself, which is super important, and something that oftentimes we don't think about, right? Being able to stop and reflect upon why it is you're feeling the way that you're feeling when you're working with a family, and how that feeling or how your experience can influence the way that you're relating to a family. And sometimes, like, so many quick decisions, right? Like, so many assumptions that you can make based off of your own family experience that might not be even close to true for others. And so without taking a moment to really explore all of the different pieces of the system, it's likely that we could be going off of our own experience. So that awareness is really, really important. And that doesn't have to necessarily mean that you're going to family therapy yourself or you're seeking a therapist yourself. More so, you're taking a moment to reflect on the things we just spoke about, right? Like, you're taking a moment to reflect upon generational transmission, and you take in birth order and things of that nature, and thinking about how that has impacted you and how that could ultimately impact the way that you relate to your clients, to families in general. Sometimes people don't like family work at all, and that could be because of an experience that they've had with their own family work. And that could be, obviously night and day from what is going to be happening, but it's really easy to steer away from something that was uncomfortable, knowing that, oh, all families hate this type of work. I don't want to make my client go through that. They don't need that. And that's because that might have been your experience, or that might have been someone in your family's experience. But again, without understanding all of the pieces, we're obviously projecting our own experiences onto our clients, and ultimately doing a large disservice, for sure. So so thinking about moving a little bit more towards like the family dynamics, we went into some of the family systems theory. The family dynamics are just patterns of interaction and behavior and relationships within a family. So it's kind of how families are with each other, how they relate to each other, the roles that they play. We did touch a bit upon some of this already, but the dynamics, that are influenced by various factors such as personality, culture, life, family history, your community, friends, the school you go to, all of the different pieces that can influence an individual, ultimately going to influence the family dynamics. And they can be healthy or unhealthy, and they play a significant role all of the time in shaping an individual's behavior and well-being and interpersonal relationships and interpersonal skills, and the way that people approach the world in general. So understanding family dynamics can help understand, again, back to understanding the person in context and the whys of why things, of the approaches that different clients could be taking towards things. So, that, as we just mentioned, family dynamics really shape the identity and the behavior, and help us understand some of the root causes, right? I think oftentimes when we're working with clients, especially at higher levels of care, there's a lot of I want to say, for like things that are kind of right in front of you that need to be taken care of instantly, but then we're focusing on treating the symptoms in front of us versus some of those underlying root causes. And so when the dust settles a bit and there's room to do more relational work, being able to understand the family dynamics is an important piece, so that you can help change environments, right? And have interventions that fit the full system and support the lasting healing that could take place. So we're not just working in crisis mode, we're actually being able to make fundamental changes that can support ongoing recovery, and relapse prevention. Oh, we're going to get into some common family dynamics, and this is going to be something I'm sure that everybody has heard, or even in regular everyday talk. This is something that we talk about often, or you see again in culture. But these are common family dynamics, especially with families that tend to work with while in eating disorder recovery work. So we have and these are family. This again is something that you'll keeping in the back of your mind, looking at families while you're working with them and thinking about what are some of the dynamics that are happening here. So you could have enmeshed families where there's a lot of emotional dependence and a lack of boundaries, and that we often see we love to use the animal metaphors and thinking about caregiving styles and ways to support loved ones and families. And oftentimes the enmeshed families, we talk about the kangaroo, right? The parent who scoops up their young and puts them in their pocket and wants to kind of take care of them. And there's a lot of emotional dependence there, and there's not a lot of boundaries. In the moment, it feels like at the time the person who's supporting the parent perhaps is feeling as though they're, really protecting and taking care of their young. But what's actually happening is that other individual isn't having an opportunity to practice, right? It's to be out there on their own and to be able to develop the skills, because someone's always kind of jumping in, and speaking for them, or for not creating any type of like independence that needs to happen. So when they are off on their own, they're able to speak for themselves and stand confidently. So it's enmeshed families. And I think we see that a lot too with families in eating disorder treatment, because there's so much fear and there's so much helplessness, from supporters. And so again, the intention behind those behaviors is typically good. I know it can lead to a lot of unhealthy outcomes, but typically, like, it comes from a place of just being really, really scared. And when you get really, really scared, you just want to hold on tight. It's really hard to trust and to let go. And so, our work as providers in any area is to really help them develop the confidence that their loved one can do it, and then to be able to pass that confidence along to their kids. And to manage the fear that they're going to be sitting in, right? It's kind of like the parallel process of the clients managing their anxiety and sitting in that discomfort. With enmeshed families, oftentimes the discomfort comes in the independence, right? So having them be able to sit through that, and manage it and trust and allow for mistakes. Those are all big, scary things, especially when you're working towards recovery, because there is a lot at stake, and it's terrifying. So the enmeshed families, we see a lot of. We also have some disengaged families where there's like an emotional distance and a lack of communication overall. So these are the families oftentimes where we'll have them come in, and it's that feeling of, okay, they're in program now, so they're good, right? And this sometimes happens as kids get older, right? Like to get into like late adolescence, early young adulthood. They're on their own, they're independent, they're wanting that independence. And so the families can and parents can often say, okay, well, they're an adult now, they've got this, they're in college, they're doing things on their own, they don't need our involvement. And oftentimes that is going to lead to high levels of disconnect and high levels of emotional insecurity in the individual. Because while they're asking for independence, you always have to question, are they asking for the independence? Is the eating disorder asking for the independence? Should we, how far do we want to keep these parents connected, knowing very well that no matter how old we all are, we all need support. And so we don't want to reinforce the idea that doing, you can be successful and do everything all on your own and you don't need people. Because no matter what age we're at, we always need people. And so we want to help disengaged families realize like that connection is actually really important, and that it doesn't mean that you're enabling or like dependence, or that your loved one is incapable of doing things on their own. It more so is the and again, right? Like I can be independent and grow up and learn how to be my own person in this world, and I can still support, like stay engaged with my family and still accept support and offer support, and that both things can happen simultaneously. It's a big important lesson for them to learn. And disengaged families, that could be one of the scenarios. It could also be the scenario that families just they're not emotionally connected and don't feel like that's their place. And then that oftentimes can lead to clients feeling uncared for, or like a burden, and feeling like that they, then going into a lot of the shoulds, like they should be able to do this on their own and their parents don't care, and all of the sort of challenging ideas and thoughts that affect ultimately the feelings and the behaviors that will lead to the eating disorder symptoms. So disengaged families, we're working towards reconnection, where like the enmeshed families, we're working towards a little bit of separation. So if you think of a Venn diagram, we're kind of looking for that even circle overlap, where there's that independence on both ends, but there's also the we that's in the middle, which is very important for a healthy ongoing relationship and with oneself and with others. So, and we have authoritarian families where there's lots of rules and not a lot of flexibility. And so This would be like a family that over controls their child's choices. Again, oftentimes this results from a fear, right? That the child isn't capable of making good choices, that they don't know what they're doing and they have to be saved. But this rigidity really kind of can then seep into other areas of our clients' lives, including the eating disorder, right? Where there's a lot of black and white thinking. There's a lot of guilt and shame if things aren't going the way that they should be, and a lot of worry that you're not doing things right. And that easily can translate into the way that people relate and have a relationship with their eating disorder. So we have permissive families where we've got the opposite end of things, where there's not enough boundaries almost. There's not enough structure. And that can oftentimes lead to clients feeling a bit like out of control, a bit like they're like out there in the universe and no one's really paying attention, which can lead to feelings of, not being cared for. And it's interesting because it all comes back to the same type of feeling, just a different manifestation within the family system, which is interesting. But then there's conflictual families where there's high levels of conflict. And that conflict is not hidden and oftentimes not expressed in a way that's healthy, which can lead to more anxiety and stress, which ultimately can lead to more eating disorder behaviors, and a more challenging recovery. So with families that are highly conflictual, we're working on supporting, healthy communication and so on, which we'll talk about in a bit. And adaptive and resilient families where families who can embrace the treatment and work collaboratively, there's good sense of communication, there's an ability to navigate challenges, ability to say things out loud, to stay separated and connected together. And that adaptive and resilient families typically comes from a lot of practice and a lot of communication and a lot of work. Because if we go all the way back, right, a lot of those concepts in family systems theory need to be approached and explored in order for families to adapt and build that resilience. So that's a big part of the recovery work is we're working towards helping families become more flexible, more adaptive, and more resilient, and less like rigid about everything. Another piece of a family dynamic that comes up oftentimes in the work that we do with families in the eating disorder treatment is the unspoken rules that can exist within a family. And so this seems very obvious and at the same time is very like important when we're in the more beginning stages of recovery maybe, or just starting to do the family work with our clients. There's a lot of unspoken rules. They change often without being able to say these things out loud. There's often disconnects. So example, explicit and implicit rules, right? Explicit is very obvious. No phones at the table, call when you get somewhere, ask before you go somewhere, those really kind of black and white rules that people know. And they know that if they don't follow those rules, there's going to be a consequence. And while there might not be a lot of, they might not like that very much, I should say, there also is very comforting to know those rules and to know that if there's a consequence, it's expected and it will be followed, right? What's more damaging are the implicit rules, the things that people don't say out loud, but that you feel, right? And so one family would be like, we don't really talk about our feelings. No one ever necessarily says that out loud. It's just that you pick that up from being in the system for a while, right? That's just something we don't do, and no one really questions why. And so that leads to internal disconnect and tension, as well as relational disconnects and tension, right? And constant, like having that dynamic play out in every area. So part of the work that we can do with our clients and families is making those implicit rules explicit. And that is really big when it comes to the eating disorder as well, because we are looking at a lot of rules that the eating disorder develops that the family has no idea that is operating within the home. Like we don't make last minute decisions to where to go to eat would be one. Or like we don't eat after 8 o'clock. Well, if you don't tell someone that rule, right? If you're not explicit about that and it happens, then it ends up in an argument. Like, but the family's left thinking like, what happened? What we just made a last minute change. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that the eating disorder has created this rule and then it's not being followed. And then that leads to a lot of feelings, a lot of negative emotions. And so if the client explains like right now, my eating disorder has these rules and I don't expect the family to follow the rules, but if the family is aware of that, it could help them understand where the tension is coming from and also help develop strategies to move through that stress and tension, right? So if you don't know, you end up in an argument pretty much. So a lot of the work, like I said, is not only naming eating disorder rules, but relational rules too, which makes for interesting conversations with families for sure and helps them, gain a lot of awareness and understanding. Mm, Understanding and helping a family understand the role of culture is really important, and how that shapes the way that they're approaching conflict and their emotional expression. There's a lot of different ways to think about culture and a lot of different cultures, obviously. So just in general, for us as supporters and care team members to understand that each culture comes with a lot of different, as we look to the right, a lot of different like rituals and customs and practices and expected behaviors and values. And understanding that is really important. Sometimes we think like, oh, that's just part of their culture. That's the way that they were raised. That helps alleviate some of the question marks we have in our mind, or might, also help us develop more culturally sensitive and empathic strategies to work with families, not assuming that we all operate the same exact way, but that there are different values that we need to make sure that we understand. And if that doesn't obvious right at the start, it's just a great question to ask. It's a great question to explore with families in terms of how their culture sees sees the role of mental health treatment, sees the role of the interdisciplinary team, what where there's could be potentially be lack of trust or different concepts and understanding. There's a lot of different pieces of like cultural beliefs that could impact the way that recovery work is performed. So just being very aware of that is, and that the dynamic is very important and something that often goes missed. Again, because we tend to operate like everyone, that everyone's kind of operating just like us, right? And even though we're all different, it's interesting. And this is like one of my favorite ways to think of things too, in terms of like family dynamics. Like if you ignore the family dynamics, it's like treating the plant without looking at the roots or the soil or the sunlight, right? So again, we briefly talked about this previously. Like we're looking at the symptoms, we're not looking at the cause. And so you can, in this analogy, you can water your plant, trim it, spray the leaves, but unless you understand like how that plant grows, where it grows, what kind of soil it needs, um, what it takes in order to prune it, and all of the pieces that go into that. Not every plant is the same, so we can't approach every plant that same way. And so making sure that the individual's symptoms are understood and the family dynamics are like explicitly stated and explored is kind of like imperative. It's like making sure that you're checking the soil, right? And you're not ignoring the ecosystem that the person lives in. So otherwise, things might look good on the surface for a little bit, but if what's underneath, isn't explored and worked on, then we're going to end up with the same results constantly. I'm going to move a little bit into family roles. And I encourage everyone to think a lot about themselves, their family, and kind of, how these roles have manifested in their own worlds as we go through these. And ultimately look at how that impacts the work that we do. So every family member typically adopts a role, whether that's conscious or unconscious, explicit or implicit. Most members have a role, and that will impact on the way that they behave, which is interesting because developmentally that could shift over time, but usually that stays relatively consistent. So talking through that, identifying that, and supporting families on understanding those roles and how they could be impacting each other is very meaningful work. Some of the main roles that we see that have been named are like the caregiver, scapegoat, golden child, mascot, black sheep, the parentified child. These are roles that are common in everyday like cultural language, and I'm sure that everybody's heard them. But just to explore a bit deeper, we have let's start with the caregiver. And that is the family member that provides the physical and emotional support. And I'm just offering a small example of each of these roles so that you can see how that plays out. So in this family in particular, Sarah would be the oldest child and takes on the role of caring for her younger siblings. She prepares with the meals, she helps with the homework, she comforts the little ones, and her parents end up relying on her to handle like household responsibilities, which ultimately could leave her feeling overly responsible, sometimes resentful, shameful if things go wrong, and have a impact ultimately on their approach to friends, to their work, and so on. So we have the caregiver, we have the scapegoat, and the scapegoat's always blamed for the family problems. So here, Tom is frequently in trouble at school. He causes his parents to argue a lot. While his behavior is problematic, the attention is diverted to him, even though the other families, like his father, are also struggling with stress, but they're not addressing it. So the scapegoat is the good way for the family to ignore some of the underlying dynamics, some of the things that could be leading to these roles being developed, and more so kind of, thinking about the quote unquote squeaky wheel, right? The one that is the most obviously distressed, while the others struggling around might be feeling equal, if not more stress and tension and disconnect, but oftentimes are not getting that attention, which oftentimes is welcomed by family members, right? That kind of can get away with going under the radar when there's a scapegoat in the family. And you have the golden child, who is the perfect child. And this Elliot's the eldest child in the family. And their parents often tell everyone how proud they are of them. They're the top student in the class, they excel at sports, they never get in trouble. However, the constant praise and high expectations can place immense pressure on them, and they feel like they can't make a mistake. And so, despite all of the outward success and accolades, they struggle with anxiety and self worth and a constant pressure to be perfect, or they're going to disappoint their family, their friends, their teachers. They have to hold up that perfect child, golden child role. Um, we have the lost child, who is more withdrawn. In this example, we would have Emma, who's the youngest child in the family, and there's a lot of conflict between her parents. So she spends hours in her room or playing alone, and while they argue, she stays out of the way, avoiding confrontation and emotional interaction, which leads to isolation and avoidance of her own feelings ultimately, right? And an inability to feel safe to express that. So you kind of these lost children, they can go into themselves, and oftentimes can get overlooked, right? They tend to be like, oh, they're good, they're fine, they're just like more quiet and shy, but they're oftentimes struggling with several things independently, alone, and trying to make sense of things, which can ultimately lead to the development of behaviors that are not healthy relationally and behaviorally. And we have the mascot in the family, the one who tends to use humor or sarcasm to get out of any type of tension or stress that could be happening. So this example, we have June, that's the youngest child, and she's constantly cracking jokes during family meetings to avoid talking about serious matters, and like her mother's recent diagnosis of cancer. So while everyone's laughing, the underlying issue of coping with the illness isn't discussed. The mascots are usually wonderful to have around in the moment, and at the same time can often lead to patterns of disconnect that go on, over time, over much too much time, right? A lot of avoidance when there's someone who makes a joke, and then it can lead the person bringing up the idea feeling like that's too much, or that they're a burden they shouldn't have. It could also kind of move the whole family out of facing tough discussions and tough conversations. And we all know that avoiding doesn't necessarily mean that it goes away. So the mascot's job is to alleviate in the moment, but over time, it's a lot of things, a lot of underlying coping that isn't taking place, and a lot of conversations that don't happen. And we have the black sheep of the family, and they tend to stand out in negative ways. In this example, Olivia's in her early 20s. She struggles with addiction, which her family finds shameful. And she feels like the black sheep because she doesn't fit into the image of success that the family has cultivated. And I know we see this a lot with our clients, who tend to feel as though they're the problem child or the black sheep. Often talk about how their siblings are successful, or they're not struggling with this, or what is wrong with them that they're struggling and the rest of their family isn't, or all of the pieces that can lead to these like more isolative, negative core thoughts and feelings about themselves, that then the family can reinforce, because they're the ones who are having the problem. They're the ones that the energy has to go to. Meanwhile, so and so's doing so wonderful, in these other areas, and oftentimes that can perpetuate eating disorder behaviors and thoughts as well. Another really common role is a parentified child, and that's the child who assumes adult responsibilities. So so in this situation, Ashley helps her mother deal with her mental health issues, provides emotional support and comfort when she's only a teenager, and her mom relies heavily on her to manage her emotions. And often, like when I hear clients talk about themselves in this dynamic, it's positive. It's like, oh, my mom and I are best friends. Like she tells me everything. I know, I all about her recent issues at work or with her partner, however that might play out. And it is a good feeling to be able to feel like you can support each other and that, everyone has problems. And at the same time, the parentified child takes it a step further, and tends to take on the role of the parent, never really gets parented themselves. And this can become obviously very burdensome with a lot of guilt saying so, right? So you don't want to say that this is too much, but you see that this dynamic is not healthy, and that even if it is an older child, it's still not a balanced dynamic, and the parentified child ends up oftentimes feeling resentful and lost and uncared for. So what do we do with all of these roles? And how do we like help support our clients? Because these roles ultimately lead to oftentimes to conflict and to stress and to tension. And so understanding, okay, now we know who's playing what role. We've talked about that piece. We have an understanding of the system underneath. Now, what do? We put them all, we kind of gather them together. We have some family therapy and take a really good look at the communication and conflict styles, right? So understanding a family's communication style is vital, right? We have to understand exactly where they're coming from, and there's different patterns of communication. And this is work that we're doing with the individuals themselves, and then we're also going to take that into the family systems work. So open, closed, assertive, passive aggressive, all of a lot of the assertiveness training that we're doing with our clients, we want to be able to translate into family systems and teach families how to be assertive, how to be direct, how to, identify the feeling that keeps them from doing so, and to encourage that open relation or open communication, and also open the door to conflict, right? Because oftentimes families can be very avoidant of conflict. And we know that our clients particularly are oftentimes avoidant of conflict. And so if they're coming from a family that does that, that reinforces that tendency to make sure that you just suppress your negative feelings and negative emotions, and that does never really leads to good things, right? Or we have the flip side where people are aggressive, they're not quite sure, they're overloaded by the emotions, the negative emotions, and they're not quite sure how to express that in a healthy way. So there ends up being a lot of confrontation, which leads to the disconnect where people are, in two separate areas and completely not relating at all, where the avoidant more so leads to the enmeshment, right? More so leads to people not being able to name their own needs. And so there's a lot of like enmeshments and what could be seen as like enablement. And then passive aggressive behavior or conflict, or communication, which is kind of that indirect hostility. And that creates a lot of that walking on eggshells feelings with families. And the eating disorder can oftentimes create this type of communication and conflict. In fact, the eating disorder you can see can really highlight all three forms of unhealthy conflict styles. So while we're working with families, and this again is really important of why we bring the families in and why we do the family work, because you can't see this until you see it, right? You can have a client explain to you the tendencies their families have, and nothing is quite the same as actually watching it in action. And if this is a style that a family struggles with, you will eventually see pieces of that in session. And so, keeping your mind on how these families are working through conflict is important, and then helping support like direct and respectful communication, oftentimes with a therapist or another professional in the room, it's kind of like having a mediator. And so you might not see everything to the extreme that it might have at home. And at the same time, you'll see the pattern. You can highlight it and point it out. And you can also not allow for people to try to get away from that conversation, which could happen more easily at home. And boundaries are another piece that we're helping clients and families with in terms of understanding that healthy boundaries ensure like privacy and respect. And there's nothing wrong with a boundary. And it doesn't mean that oftentimes people feel like setting a boundary is rejecting someone or to not allowing for connection, but often it's quite the opposite. By people knowing where boundaries are and being able to state their boundaries, then you're able to have much healthier of connection, and you're feeling much more respected, and you can respect other people. You can say like this is just where their boundary is. It's not about me. It's not about us. It's just where they're comfortable. And those poor boundaries lead again to the enmeshment or the disengagement. Same dynamic, right? We're looking at constantly thinking about the families either going too far apart or too close on top of each other. As people on the care team, as any provider, we can really, the most important thing I think we can do are these three things in terms of like identifying the roles and the dynamics and the communication styles, and to asking the questions that get to the root of these things, and then being able to name these things for families and encourage communication and open dialogue around that. And being able to bring up things that often aren't, right? So back to those implicit and explicit rules that govern families or dynamics in families, we want to help support the communication around this with our families, which encourages the client to do so in every area of life. But family therapy is a really great opportunity to do this. And then from after communicating that, then helping build boundaries. Like, what does that look like? How do we say that in a way that's respectful? How do we help other people hear that? How is the family system responding to that? What is the culture around boundaries, right? Not only culturally in the family, but also like systemically and in the community that they're in. And so bringing in all of those pieces while we're helping break these unhealthy patterns, it's keeping everything in mind from the bottom up. Um, it's a lot of the work that we do. And so if we think about kind of all of that, right, that all of the work that we're doing with families, all of the benefits, all the possibilities, it was really interesting is then we can think about the way that we do this, right, and the way and the team that we do this with, and really think about the interdisciplinary team that we're all working with as a family, right? So it mirrors family dynamics in several ways, especially when everybody's working on a shared goal together. So in interdisciplinary teams, oftentimes there's roles, there's boundaries, there's blurred boundaries, communication patterns that are both healthy and unhealthy. There's oftentimes like very similar principles. The context is a bit more professional. Sometimes it's not. But the concepts are the same. And so we think about becoming a better team, working more effectively, working in a way that's more supportive and more encouraging for our patients' families is kind of really important to look at how we operate as an interdisciplinary team. So teams are like families, right? So here we say like their systems, the roles reemerge. There's a lot of disconnect. There's issues with communication, issues with conflict, issues with boundaries and enmeshment and aggression and passive aggressiveness and all of those pieces. So the team is really a family system, which is interesting. So as we get into this next part of the presentation, I encourage you to think about your team that you're working with now and how some of these things show up. And just to go through a couple of the different concepts, right, that are relatable and that mirror each other in terms of family systems and dynamics there, and team systems and dynamics there. We have interdependence, which each member's input and expertise affect the overall functioning of the team, right? So a therapist approach can impact how the dietitian or the medical professional provides client support. Right, we have to be able to think about it's not only us working with the client, it's all of our team members, and we all need each other. Just same thing with the family. We are one system. We are not an independent provider, even in an outpatient setting, right? Even when we're not necessarily all working in the same building, we are all working together as a team to support a client and family. So the team members work in smaller units based on their areas, and it's really important in this to make sure that the roles are defined and that the boundaries are maintained, right? Especially with eating disorders who tend to do a lot of splitting. There's a lot of good cop, bad cop, making sure that, what the eating disorder hears and how it's translated. And then you can get into a lot of conflict with different team members, especially if there's things taken out of context, right? So communication is really important, and also knowing your role on the team, not so that you can't influence each other and have conversations and talk as a team, but it's important to know, that if, for example, as myself or as a therapist, I'm not changing meal plans, right? I could go to the dietitian and talk with them about how the meal plan is impacting them emotionally and what we can do to support in collaboration, but I'm not changing the meal plan, even if that's what I think should be done or shouldn't be done, right? The teams are often striving for stability, right? Same thing as a family. So if a team is working well together, they might not want to like make so many changes. They might not want to like, everything's going really well with this client. Maybe, and here comes the doctor who wants to add a new medication, and that could cause some stress and tension because we're doing good and we don't want to shake things up. So understanding that like that homeostasis is always kind of the goal of the team while also allowing for like change. And that often comes from communication, right? Being able to talk together and explain the whys, and not just making changes that are going to disrupt that homeostasis, but more so why, and then working together to get back to that routine. And that stability is important. And as a team, the roles, influence the dynamic and the flow of information. And so we want to make sure that we're not only clear on our roles, but we're clear on everybody else's roles too. And so like communication patterns, just like with families, are very important, and they can change over time. They can change when a new member is introduced. So teams with open and transparent communication work effectively, where teams with poor communication struggle, right? Same as families. And conflicts can arise when team members can disagree. So how a team handles the conflict is going to affect the team's cohesion and their ability to provide effective care. Super similar to families, right? When families aren't working together and when they don't handle conflict well, then the cohesion and the ability to maintain healthy dynamics starts to shift and change. Team dynamics are influenced by backgrounds and experiences of each member, including their education, their professional culture, personal beliefs, same as family systems that we see. And teams also experience stress, right? So they have to rely on healthy coping mechanisms and supporting each other. So dysfunctional coping can affect an overall performance, right? So a lot of parallels there to what we talked about with families. If there's poor communication, or there's a shift in roles, or someone is taking on too much or not taking on enough, that can affect an overall performance of a team and the health of each individual member. So making sure that clinicians, as well as any other provider, can easily replicate family roles, right? So we want to be aware, same way we want to be with the families, we want to be aware of our team members, right? And what roles that, not only what roles each member falls into, but what role you tend to fall into, and what particular trigger as a team member will come about that brings you into that role. So is there something specific that makes you step into the fixer role? Or is there something that makes you more of like the lost child and be more quiet? Like what is it around that could be potentially bringing these roles out? And thinking more from like a systems perspective versus like each individual part of treatment and of providing. It's more so thinking about the whole team and the underlying sort of, soil, back to the soil. And so the roles in the team, again, looking at these and how they play out in teams, they're scapegoats, and that team members constantly blamed for problems. For an example, if like if a team is underperforming, the dietitian could be blamed for not making the right changes or not doing it quick enough, right? And so then they become the reason why treatment isn't going well and why the client isn't doing well. And in a system, we could have a golden child, and that's like the star, right? The one who does everything right. The psychologist could be regarded as the most valuable player, like in this example, for their ability to connect with clients, and they receive a lot of praise while all of the other team members are not receiving any recognition, right? And they're the ones who not only get the praise from the teams themselves, but also from the client and the family. And that can lead to a lot of negative emotions on the other side and a lot of pressure for that team member. We have on a team, oftentimes people can step into a caretaker role, and that's someone who could take on extra tasks or responsibilities and neglect their own needs. And an example would be like a therapist who overextends themselves and offers additional support, which we see all the time. And then they start to feel overwhelmed, right? And then that begins the disconnect. And so then they drift further and further with more and more like negative emotions. And so that could impact them, and it'll also impact the rest of the team, and make other team members kind of in a state of imbalance, right? And we have lost children on our teams. Those are the ones that kind of tend to stay in the background. they're not feeling maybe empowered or confident, or they might not feel like they're important and they might not say what they need to say. And so they could be highly competent, but just completely overlooked. An example would be like a social worker who has valuable insights, but stays silent during meetings, letting more outspoken members take control of the conversation. Even though they have a lot of important things to say, they might feel, for example, that a medical provider is more important, and so they sit back. But their piece of information could make it, a substantial impact on the overall course of treatment, even if it's something they consider to be small. In each team, there might be an enabler, and that's someone who steps in to fix the problems of others. And a team member who might consistently like cover for a colleague who's late, or maybe help with paperwork, or not necessarily say some of the things that are happening that shouldn't be happening to their supervisor, for example. Someone who just wants to like avoid any type of conflict on the team, and so they just kind of like enable things to continue to go on their way, which can lead to a lot of unhealthy team dynamics. And there's a black sheep on the team sometimes, and they're the ones who tend to challenge the group consensus and like question methods, and sometimes refuse to go along with decisions that they disagree with. So their actions can create tension, and they can hinder cooperation, and they can also like support like thinking critically and avoiding complacency. So there's a positive to that piece. There might be like an example here is a nutritionist might question the team methods set by medical staff, pushing the team to reevaluate certain protocol. But this could cause conflict with those who like more traditional approaches. So black sheep like to shake the pot a little bit. And sometimes that's really good as long as it's done in a healthy way. And so I was hoping to just kind of run through how this could play out in a short case study where we would have 15-year-old Sophia, who's referred to treatment for restrictive eating and anxiety. A core concept is what's unresolved or unspoken in the system reenacts in other systems, including clinical teams. And so the goal here is to explore how the roles show up in interdisciplinary teams, each member playing a role in maintaining homeostasis that we talked about earlier. So we have the Rodriguez family. Mom is Angela. She's the caregiver. She's emotionally reactive and enmeshed with Sophia. Carlos is the lost child. He's quiet, emotionally distant, avoids conflict. Lewis is the golden child, highly achieving, excelling in everything. We've got Maya, the mascot, who's playful, and Sophia, the scapegoat, who causes the problems and tells things like they are. And this is the family, and these are their roles that have been identified. In this system, we'd see like Angela and Sophia would have blurred boundaries. Carlos defers decision making, rarely expressing opinions. Luis is praised while Sophia is subtly criticized. Maya lightens the mood. Sophia's symptoms are seen as an expression of dysfunction. And this would, as a therapist, you'd be in the session and kind of seeing some of these roles play out and how that happens. And so in the team meeting, like later in the day, the team's talking about Sophia's progress, and the therapist says that I'm worried that we're reinforcing the same dynamic. Sophia's trying to find her voice, but we're working through her mom. And the dietitian responds, well, if we don't keep the mom engaged, she could pull Sophia. And the psychiatrist doesn't say anything. And then the nurse cracks a joke and says something about getting Angela a staff badge, and people laugh and the tension goes unnamed. And then the clinical director comes in and says, let's stay focused. Sophia's medically stable. We've seen improvement. Let's not complicate it. And no one really asks the dietitian how she's feeling, because it's not really about the nutrition, and no one really checks in on how the therapist's feeling, even though you can tell there was some defensiveness and frustration. Instead, the meeting just kind of moves along. And this is a situation. So in this situation, you can see the same roles, right? You've got the therapist who's a truth teller and says the hard things, with the nurse who's making jokes, the dietitian who's over accommodating and keeping the peace, the psychiatrist who's withdrawn and avoids emotional engagement, and then the clinical director who's the golden child and values like outcomes and control. And that's just like an illustration of how this kind of shows up, right? The therapist becomes overly identified, the dietitian accommodates Angela's food requests, enmeshment appears, the psychiatrist remains distant, the nurse uses humor, the program director favors interventions for Luis. So again, here's a really good like parallel here. The Sophia's silence, the therapist is minimized, mom dominates, the dietitian over identifies, dad's disengaged. the psychiatrist is distant, and Maya's deflects with humor, nurse uses humor, and Louise idealized. And so are the high performing cases by the clinical lead. And again, in context, I know I'm kind of moving towards the end of time, but in context here, we have Sophia and also the therapists who are the scapegoats, and they're often the one who's naming the dysfunction, but they're seen as too intense and too emotional, and often isolated, while the caretakers, mom and the dietitian, they over-identify and avoid challenging the system. We've got Carlos and the psychiatrist who don't get emotionally involved and maintain professional distance. The mascot, which is Maya, and the nurse keep the tone light, and then the golden child who gives more attention to compliance and ignores messy dynamics for surface level progress. So super interesting to see how they mirror each other in these situations. And the goal of it all is to really kind of, again, bring into the conversation some awareness, right? So recognizing the roles when you're on a team and you're in a team meeting, paying attention to who's falling into what role, and then reflecting on how that could be impacting overall dynamics, and thinking about like, oh, maybe they're laying low and being and withdrawing because the other one is using humor, and that's frustrating them, right? So kind of figuring out what patterns are taking place, and talking more about that versus each individual person, right? Not saying it's so-and-so's fault, but more so like the dynamic in the group is such, and so that's creating disconnect. And we need to repair this so that we can do our best for our clients, right? We need to bring back a level of homeostasis here, and have everybody's voice be equal, and create a space where everybody can speak, right? And so we want to, in terms of team meetings, sometimes, or teams in general, sometimes we can get into cycles and people can fall into roles and people don't check in. And so as a team member, it's important to note like, hey, I've noticed that you tend to be like shying away from everything. Is everything going on? Okay, we get in hear your voice, and it's important what you have to say. Things like that, where we're bringing the same dynamic in the family. We're bringing everybody up and into the table with an equal voice in a healthy way. We want to do the same things with our team members as we treat clients. And, as we move forward to kind of like consistently staying curious about family patterns with our clients and our families, and also with our teams, right? Understanding a bit about how these patterns impact the way that we treat the people that we're working with, and also how they impact the people that we're working with and the way they respond to our treatment. So it's dynamic and sort of goes back and forth. And keeping communication consistent across a team, both like for the interdisciplinary team homeostasis purpose, and also to make sure that we're communicating to all members of the team what's happening with the family and the family dynamics. So if something really big can happen within a family system, and if we don't let the rest of the team know, then there's not a lot of understanding as to why maybe something else happened, where there could be, oh, I understand now there was this conflict, and this, the client who tends to, step into the black sheep role did so. And so this is why this could be happening. But this all involves a lot of communication, and not thinking like, oh, that was just family work, we're just going to put that over there. No, because their family work could easily impact their nutritional goals and the way that they respond to medicine and so on. So we want to keep empowering our families to grow, and keeping blame out of it. There's a lot, obviously, eating disorders are shame-based, and there's a lot of blame, mostly self-blame, with our clients and with our families. I can't tell you how many times I hear families say, like, what did I do wrong? Well, this is my fault. Sometimes they'll bring it back to like one sentence they said 15 years ago. And they're constantly kind of looking for a way to blame themselves. And so again, we're not looking to give a solution to that or to change that, but more so to like offer other possibilities for them and have them explore other dynamics and things that could be at play. And so then we'd be able to actually change those dynamics and ultimately change the relational approach and the response to recovery. And, obviously goes without saying, change happens through relationships and in connection. Nobody, eating disorders don't develop in isolation. And so you can't recover in isolation. And nothing really can happen in isolation if we really think about it. And our clients tend to be high performing and very driven and want to do everything on their own. And it takes a lot to remind them and the families that that's impossible, and that everybody needs each other, and that the team needs them, the team needs each other as well, and that we're all working to understand these dynamics, and to repair the disconnects and move together in connection towards recovery. And lastly, just kind of, again, changing the structure of the family, change the structure of the family, Minuchin said, and the behaviors of its members will change accordingly. So that really kind of is at the core of it all, right? Every team member, everybody on this call, everyone that's working with our clients has the power to influence positive change in family systems. Our goal is just to not ignore them, but to bring awareness. And that's it. I just saw you pop on screen, Jamie.
Excellent job, Allie. I know you were so in your zone during the presentation, but please just take a second to look at the chat. You are getting so much love, and people are saying that they really appreciate you and this wonderful presentation. And it's so interesting to see a discussion about family dynamics and team dynamics together. And we do have a question. We have time for just one of the questions. This comes from an anonymous attendee. It says, "What are some signs that a team might be reenacting unhealthy family dynamics without realizing it? Any way to correct this?"
That's a great question, right? That's like kind of the whole thing is how do we notice when this is happening? Because sometimes it's been so ingrained, right? Sometimes some of us fall into the same patterns and you're working with the same team for quite a while. And so it just like with a family, right? You don't take a moment to step back and think about it. But I think it starts with the knowledge, right? With understanding that these roles exist, that these dynamics are there. And then once we have that knowledge, if we can take a step back, even in your next team meeting or in your next interaction with your colleagues, right? And think about like, oh, wow, I wonder, like, I can see that they're doing this and that they can, and then you can really think about it and think, oh, they consistently are the one who make jokes, right? Like consistently the one who when the conversation gets hard, they want to loosen things up, or if there's conflict. And so why, and so then you can notice that and you can explicitly state it. Right. Like, so you can say, hey, I notice that you're always making jokes, which I totally appreciate. It's like super helpful. And at the same time, like, I'm wondering, like, if you need some support or if you think that this conversation is really uncomfortable and what we can do to make it more comfortable. But more so, I think it all starts with the awareness and then like the same thing like with families, right? And then trying to not necessarily offer a solution, but more so explore why that role is being like, stepped into and what we can do to help them step out of that and more into like a homeostasis.
Excellent. The comments are still coming in, Allie. Just want to say thank you, Erica. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Patrice, Lucia, Elizabeth, Kelly. Just lots of love and just lots of compliments and validation on everything that you said. Thank you, Stanley. Great session. I can absolutely apply the roles in my family growing up and the family that my wife and I are raising in our own roles. So great job. And thank you all so much for hanging in. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of our longer days of the summit, and we have one more session today. So I hope that you will stick around and join us for our session at 3:30. Again, just pertaining to CEs, I've gotten a few questions about how to get the CEs. At the completion of each of the CE sessions and all of the sessions, you will have an opportunity to complete an evaluation. Once you complete the evaluation, you will then be able to download your certificate at the completion of the summit. So to just keep from having 3 or 4 different pieces of paper, we will have these certificates available at the completion of all of the sessions tomorrow afternoon. But in the interim, you are welcome to go to the CEGO dashboard, complete your evaluations, and also revisit any of the presentations that you really enjoyed. So the recordings for the presentations are there also. So just take a moment to regroup, get a drink, get something to eat, stretch your legs, go outside, do whatever you like, and we will see you back at 3:30. Thank you so much and great job, Allie. So proud of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.
Too.
Bye.